Hello and welcome indeed to Knitter Matters. This is season 4, episode 9. I'm Cheryl and I'm delighted that you're here. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm a fibre artist, I'm a knitting educator, I'm a Craft Yarn Council certified instructor for knitting, and many moons ago I used to be the proud owner of a yarn store in Brighton, England. And one of the great joys of that is that I was able to teach people how to knit. I loved doing it then and I love doing it now. Now, in the last episode, season 4, episode 8, it was all about Ladderback Jacquard for stranded knitting, and I showed how to do this great technique without trapping or catching the float, and I demoed how to do it in the round, and I got great feedback from you. Thank you so much for that. I really love getting your feedback. You loved the technique, as do I, and several people asked actually if it could be done in flat knitting. So that's what we're going to be doing in this episode. I'm going to switch to the worktop. You'll notice that I've also got a grey. If you've watched Knitter Matters before, you'll notice that I've got a grey worktop. I'm hoping that that will stop some of the high contrast with the camera. So let's see how we go with that. So Ladderback Jacquard. This is really what we're talking about. Now, just to recap, it's used in stranded knitting to control long floats. And what's a long float? Well, for me, it's more than, say, 5 or 6 stitches. Long floats can catch on jewellery and fingers and snag the knitting, apart from anything else. And particularly in children's garments, little fingers can easily get caught up in very long floats. And that can be very frustrating, both for the child and for the knitting. Also, long floats can be a nightmare when it comes to maintaining tension. I find that the longer the float, the harder it is to manage my tension. I do know many knitters that work with stranded knitting all the time, and they cope with long floats very well without trapping them, catching them, or doing anything, and their tension is great. Now, if you're one of those people, continue what you're doing, and that's wonderful. But for the rest of us, I think you might like to know this technique. It can be used in any area of stranded knitting where you have your long floats. You can combine it with other types of stranded knitting. Say if you're doing Fair Isle and you're doing a pattern that the row requires 3 and 3, well, you don't need to do anything with those floats then, because you're going to catch them when you change colour. But if you then switch to a part of your knitting where you have a longer float, this is a really good technique to use. So, and if you're doing things like hats, let me just show you what our ladderback does. This is what we do. You can see that we're doing something with the floats, but it's not locked to the front side of the knitting. I'll come back to this piece in a minute because there's some other things I want to show you with that. Now, for hats or toys or things where the reverse is concealed, or not accessible, it might not be necessary to do anything with the floats. When I did this bauble, I could have happily left these floats, and I think I did in part because, of course, it's not going to be seen on the wrong side. It's got a polyfoam ball in the middle of that, so nobody's going to see the wrong side. But my tension wasn't great in parts when I did this, so this technique would have been perfect for that. Also, it can be used anywhere, as I said, where you need to control the floats because you've got a long gap between the next colour. In this little bit of intarsia, well, actually it's not intarsia, I was doing Armenian knitting here, and I was showing different ways of doing, catching and trapping floats. But let's say I had been wanting to do this in some form of intarsia, especially if I was changing colour for every heart. This technique of Ladderback Jacquard would have been perfect for that. Okay, so let's get started and I'll show you how to do it. So, let me just sort of go over again why it's such a good technique. This is the sample from the last episode, and as you can see, we've got a beautifully smooth surface. It's nice and stretchy, it gives, which is what you want, some elasticity in stranded knitting. And my tension is certainly better with this technique than it is in many other types of stranded knitting. So, and as you can see very easily here, you know, it's only connected where we've got the colour work. The rest of the time it's floating free. And you get a lovely, lovely surface. You don't get any puckering, and you get very little show through too, which is really nice if you're doing strong colours. Okay, let's get started. Now, normally I like to do my stranded knitting. I like to work it in both hands, but to simplify things, I'm going to just pick up and drop each colour as I'm using it. Now, all I've done here is get started with my first row. The principle is absolutely the same as in the circular knitting, but because we have a purl side when we're knitting flat, we need to do something on that wrong side that we don't have to consider when we're working in the round. So, as I say, what I've done here is start the row with, I've darted a purple stitch, I've done 2 of my contrast colour in this pink, I've done 3 more in purple, and now I need to do a float loop. So I bring my main colour to the front of the work, to the right side of the work here. Now what I need to do, and that's a really important, that's the most important thing you have to remember, otherwise you're not going to get a free floating ladder back. Now I need to do a backward loops cast on with my thumb and put that on the right needle. I'll be doing this a few more times, so you'll be able to see as I go along. Now I need to take my main colour yarn to the back of the work again, and I need to do 3 more stitches there. Okay, now I'm just going to pick up my pink and do my 2 stitches for my little block of colour there. I'm going to now do my 3 stitches, because this would be a float of 6 stitches. I don't want a float of 6 stitches. I need to put a float loop somewhere in those 6 stitches, and because it's 6, I'm going to put it in the middle. If you have an odd number, you can put it where you like. If you've got a really long float, you can put more than 1 ladder back in. But the principle is the same. So here is my 3 out of my 6 main colour stitches. Now I need to do another float loop. Backwards loop cast on, I'm going to, what I did there, I just bring that yarn around my thumb, pop that on the right needle. Sorry, that other needle's getting in the way. Let me do it again in case you haven't seen me do that before. I'm bringing my pink yarn, I'm going to loop that around my thumb, then I loop that onto my right hand needle, okay? And did you spot the deliberate error there? I forgot to bring my yarn forward, and that's really important. Let me show you what happens if I don't do that. Let me show you on the back. You can see where I did that first float loop. It really is just floating free. There's nothing to hold it. Where I've made the mistake there and didn't bring my yarn forward, you can see that it's actually caught by the yarn. So I've trapped it, which is not what I'm trying to do. So if you don't remember to do that, what you are doing is basically trapping your yarn, which is not what we do for this technique. So I'm glad I made that mistake in a way, because it sort of shows you what you get if you don't do it right. So bring that forward. My main colour is brought forward. I'm going to do a backwards loop, increase or cast on with my thumb. Now I'm going to take that main colour to the back of the work, to the wrong side of the work. I've now got to do another 3 stitches. And then I bring my pink up, because this is where I'm doing just my 2 change colour stitches, back to my main colour. I do think that grey background is working a lot better. We're not getting such high sort of contrast when I'm moving my hands. It confuses the camera somehow. So I need to bring my yarn forward, remember, backwards loop onto the right hand needle, then bring my main colour yarn to the back of the work again. Okay, and then I just finish off that row with my 2 pink stitches and my purple. Okay, so that's our row, exactly as it would have been if we were working in the round. Now this is where we have to do something a little different, but it's actually really, really simple. When I was sitting there the first question came in of, can we do it in the flat? I'm thinking, I know we can, I've just got to work this out. And it was actually a lot easier than I expected it to be. So sometimes I overcomplicate things. So I'm going to start my purl row. I'm just going to bring my pink yarn up as I would anyway, because this is the little blocks of 2 colour. And I'm going to carry on with my main colour yarn. Nothing exciting there. Now, I've got to the point where I need to do something with this float loop, which when you're working in the round, of course, you're just knitting that when you come to it, but you are still bringing the yarn forward and backwards. Now, what I have to do here is take my purple yarn, my main colour yarn, to the back of the work, but it's actually the right side of the work, the knit side. So whichever way you find that easier to remember, because obviously when we're doing it in the round, it's the front of the work or the back of the work. This can get confusing when we're doing it in the flat, because yes, this is the back of the work, this is not the public side, but my yarn has to go that way. So I'm going to really try to remember just to say the knit side or the right side of the work, and the purl side and the wrong side of the work when I'm knitting this flat, so as not to confuse you. Now I need to bring my pink yarn up, and all I do is purl that float loop. I'm going to purl that. Now I have to remember to bring my yarn back to the wrong side, the purl side. Now continue. I'm going to do the same thing again. Take my purple yarn, my main colour, to the right side of the work, okay, to the knit side. Bring my pink yarn up. Oh, that's not, yeah, sorry. These are my colour blocks. I don't have to do that there. Sorry. There we go. My 2 stitches. I'm trying to do 3 things at once here and I'm confusing myself. Sorry about that. But I've got 2 more of these to do, so you'll see it again. I need to do my purple main colour stitches, just as I ordinarily would. Now I'm at my float loop. So I take my main colour yarn, take it to the knit side of the work, the right side of the work, bring up my pink yarn or whatever colour you're working with, your contrast, your inactive yarn, if you will. Purl that. Remember to bring your main colour yarn to the back of the work, to the purl side. Carry it on. If you are seeing my 3rd finger there, it's not dirt. I trapped it in a door some weeks ago, and it's still working its way up my finger. So sorry if that looks rather ugly, but it is what it is. So 2 more of my stitches here of my block colour, back to my purple. Okay, get to where I have to do something with my float loop. I take my main colour yarn to the knit side, the right side of the work. I bring up my pink yarn and pull that float loop. Then I bring my main colour yarn back to my purl side and just finish that row. Okay. So, and what's so cool about this technique, as you can see, it's kind of, there's the 2 stitches, which is my sort of colour block. That's my float loop, and it's going up with the knitting, providing I remember to bring my yarn forward and backwards to the right side, the wrong side. It's going to stay floating free and it's not going to get caught. So that's what you get on the right side, and that is what we get on the wrong side. And as you can see, that's floating nice and free. The only place it's fixed is on the needle for the time being, but it's, as I said in the last episode, although we can call this an increase, we're not increasing the number of stitches. That's really important to remember. We're not increasing the number of stitches. We are for the row, but we're not including those. So that brings me nicely to how we would finish that block of colour off. And again, it's much simpler than we might think. So to finish my ladders, let me switch to this piece of knitting where I've done exactly the same thing here, but I've just done a few more rows, and you can see really well there how that pink, the float loop has sort of travelled up, and on the back side it looks like this. Okay, let's get that one out the way. So remember, we're not casting off here. We just want to, we finish this block of colour. We don't need this bit of ladderback anymore. We're going on to something else or a different pattern, whatever it may be. So, and remember I said we're not including these float loops in the stitch count. If you have a pattern where it's telling you how many stitches you should have per row, if it's not specifying this technique, just remember not to count those float loops. If it's specifying the technique, then it's probably including those. But you're not really counting these because they're part of the knitting, but we're not working them, if you see what I mean. So this will sort of become much clearer now. So what I'm going to do now, I need to do something with these float loops because I'm going on to Can you believe it? I've got no yarn there. How did I manage to do that? Oh well, here we go. Okay. Actually, no, I don't need it, do I? Because I'm getting rid of it. Sorry. Let's say I'm finishing off this colour. Okay, so I'm just... That's why I cut it off, so it wouldn't get in the way. And then I forgot what I did there. Okay, so this is all fine. I'm just knitting my main colour across. Now, when I get to my float loop, I've got two choices. If my main colour is to the right of my float loop, my ladder stitch, all I need to do is SSK it. Slip, slip, and then knit through the back of the loops. And then give that a little tug at the back just to completely hide it. I'll show you another way of doing it in a minute. Now, I'm just knitting straight across because I've finished. I'm not binding off, remember. I'm just finishing that block of colour. I don't need to be using this ladder back for this section of or the next section of my knitting. So last time I had my main colour to the right of my ladder stitch and I SSK'd it. Now I'm going to do it differently here so that my main colour is to the left of my float loop. All I do now is knit two together. And again, I give that a little tuck at the back. I'll do it one more time. My preference is actually the SSK. I just like it a bit more. But you may find that you prefer the knitting two together. So my main colour is to the right of my float loop. So I'm doing slip, slip, knit through the back of the loops and off the needle. But remember, if you prefer to do the knit two together, your main colour needs to be to the left of your float loop. Right, okay. So we have finished off that little bit of ladderback. You can see now that it's fixed firmly. It's not going to go anywhere. Not going to go anywhere at all there. And you can carry on with the rest of your knitting, which is exactly what I did here. And I'll flip this over. I just did these blocks of colour so you could see, and I did different things. Here is what we've just done with our ladderback and fastened it off there. Here I actually did two ladderbacks in the float. As I said earlier, if you've got a super long float, you can do as many ladders as you want. And again, I just fasten them off when I change colour. Now, this one at the top is a little different because sometimes you want to anchor those floats. You don't always want them floating about on that first row. And I think even if you are, you know, if you're making a hat, or certainly if you're making a garment, you might prefer to anchor the floats. But if you're making a hat, you might just prefer to anchor that first row of stitches anywhere where, again, that, you know, fingers, jewelry can catch it. It's a good technique to use. So here you can see I have anchored that float. I can get my needle up behind. If you can see that, then it, you know, none of that ladder back is attached, but it is attached there, and of course it's attached at the top. So if you want to anchor your ladder, here is what we do. I'm actually gonna swap this needle out here. Sorry. Let me put this on a straight needle rather than a circular, because I ran out of needles for what I was doing and just pulled up a circular, but I want to be knitting on the same needles so it's not confusing. Okay, so what do we do here? So again, I'm use the principle of my colour, 2 stitches of blocks of colour, and now I want to do a float loop and I want to anchor it. So the first thing I'm going to do is I've got to where I want my ladder, my first float loop, and with my main colour, my grey, I'm going to work a lifted increase into the next stitch. Remember, we're not really increasing, but that's what we're calling it. And you'll see why it won't end up as an increase in the number of stitches in a moment. So if you don't know how to do a lifted increase, you go to the row below the stitch that's on the needle. So this is my row below there. And I pick up that right leg of the stitch, the row below, and I put it onto my left needle. Okay. Now I'm going to get my green, my inactive colour, which happens to be green on this one, and I'm just going to knit into that lifted increase. Okay, and now I'm going to carry on. So I'm going to knit my 3 there. I'm going to knit my green block of colour. I'm going to knit 3 more stitches, and I'm going to do the same thing again. This is where I want my float loop, so I'm going to lift that right leg of the stitch below the one on the needle, pop it onto my left needle. I'm going to knit that lifted stitch with my inactive, my green yarn in this case, and then I'm going to carry on. I'm going to do my block of 2 here, another 3, and 1 more float loop. I'm doing my lifted increase, so I'm looking for, this is the fellow here, this is the stitch, and this is the one that I'm going to lift up and put on the left hand needle. That's the one I'm going to knit with my green, and now I'm going to carry on here and finish my row, and then I'll show you what we do on the return row, which is really no different to what we've been doing before. Okay, let me turn that round. Now you can see now that that is caught, which is what we wanted to do, whereas when I was doing this one, I didn't want to catch them. I wanted those to float free. This I want to anchor for that first row. You don't do it on any other row, otherwise it's not really sort of ladder back then. Just try and untangle some of my yarns here. There we go. Okay, so on the return row, on the purl row, exactly what we have been doing. That's my block of colour. I'm going to get up to where my lifted increase or my inactive yarn was used for the float loop. And this is why it's exactly the same as what we did before. We take our main colour yarn to the front of the work, rather the knit side of the work. We bring our inactive colour, the contrast colour, and we purl that loop. We must remember to bring that main colour yarn back to us at the purl side and carry on. Knit my block of 2. Here we go again with our float loop. Take my main yarn to the front of the work, to the knit side, if you will. Purl my float loop. Bring my main colour back to the purl side, to the wrong side again. Carry on. You still have to do that backwards and forwards, because otherwise you're locking the stitch, which is not what we're planning to do. So that's the one thing that you have to remember. Take my yarn to the right side of the work, away from me. Purl my stitch, my loop stitch that we did from the lifted increase. Bring my grey yarn back again and finish my row. And that is all there is to it. And I would say with this technique, once you've practiced it, you wondered how you didn't know about it before, or you wondered why you hadn't used it. It's wonderful. And again, now, you will get a slight, you may be able to see slightly where your lifted increase was as you go up with the knitting, but it's on the first row. Once you get further up, you're not going to see it. It's inevitable that you will see it if you really look closely. I mean, you're not going to see it in a garment or a piece of knitting, but if you really look closely, you might see it, as opposed to where it's sort of free and there is no difference. You cannot see where those ladders were started because this one is floating free. But I almost defy you to pick it out. You'd have to look very closely. Now, if you're doing a very high contrast yarn, you may see it, but honestly, it really, you know, this is my knitting where this sample is where I did the anchor stitch on the first row here, and this, by the time I've, you know, done a few rows, you know, I'd be hard pressed to find it. If I really wanted to find it, I could, but it always looks worse on that first row that you've done because it's not had time to sort of settle in and the ladders to work their way up. But this is the same thickness of yarn as this is, and you know, yes, if I really pull that apart, I can see that I've done my lifted increase there. But you know, you've really got to want to find it to see that. Okay, well, now I'm going to go back to the main screen. I really hope you enjoyed that part, this part 2 of Ladderback Jacquard. I really hope you try the technique. I think you'll love it. And if you have any questions about it, please just email me, Cheryl@knittermatters.com, or you can private message me on the Knitter Matters page, or put a comment in the thread below. The way the page is set up, it doesn't allow for you to put questions in. It's I don't know why that is, but it doesn't allow you to post your questions if it's not in a thread, is what I mean, of comments. But you can certainly post in the comments below about the technique, or, as I say, private message me or email me, Cheryl@knittermatters.com. So thank you so much for watching. This was season 4, episode 9. It's part 2 of Ladderback Jacquard technique. And as I say, message me about any knitting matter, because if you have a question, then somebody else probably has had that question, and it gives me ideas for future topics. If you want to watch this episode again, it's uploaded later to YouTube, and it again, season 4, episode 9. If you're searching for it later, YouTube is actually the easiest way to find it. There's all the videos that I've listed there. There's over 100 of them now on various knitting topics. And if you want a playlist of all the subject matters and what we cover, just let me know. Message me again, and I will be happy to send you that as a PDF for ease of reference when you're looking up a technique. So thank you so much for watching, and until next time, keep well, keep calm, and keep knitting. Bye bye for now.